Thank you all again for joining us today. I'm Lori Lapaki, and I'm one of the founding members of Aspirion, and I currently serve as Senior Vice President for Executive Sponsorship. I work closely with our thought leadership team to help bring educational sessions like the one today to our healthcare partners across the country. So today it's our pleasure to present part one of our series on cracking the code on motor vehicle accident claims as a way to increase your cash collections on this segment of your revenue cycle. During the first session today, we're going to focus on ways to identify how much opportunity you may have with your current processing. We'll also give you some recommendations for account identification, coverage investigation, and billing. In our part two session, which is going to be on September 11th, we're going to talk more specifically about hospital liens and other methods of third-party liability collections, some recent changes in case law and regulatory requirements that may be impacting you and your location. And we also want to provide some important recommendations to help you avoid any legal risk with your program. Now, before I introduce today's speakers, I want to provide you just a quick overview, an introduction to Aspirion. So Aspirion provides services to hospital providers across the United States for the most complex segment of your revenue cycle. We focus on claims that need specialized investigation, billing, and resolution, such as your MBA, work comp, Veterans Affairs, and out-of-state Medicaid claims, as well as claims that may be held up by revenue integrity issues, such as denials, underpayments, and various types of aging AR. We actually began this type of work back in 2006 as a law firm when our local hospital system reached out to us for help with their motor vehicle accidents and other accident third-party liability claims. And so with the success of that program, the demand for our services grew over the next few years. And in 2012, we decided to dissolve the law firm and officially become Aspirion. So we have a great team at Aspirion with the expertise needed to get these claims paid. That team consists of over 180 attorneys and legal professionals, more than 80 clinicians, over 1,400 claims specialists, and a large team of technology experts, including data scientists and software engineers who are leading our developments in business intelligence, machine learning, analytics, and automation. So presenting today, we have two of our executive team members who have many years of experience with motor vehicle accidents and accident third-party liability collections. We have Josh McVey, who's our general manager over our MBA and TPL services, and Martin Drake, who is an attorney serving as our senior director of complex claims legal. So now it's my pleasure to turn it over to Josh and Martin so they can share a little bit more about their experience and get us started on today's session. Josh?
Great. Thank you, Lori. So as noted, my name is Josh McVey, and I'm the general manager of the MBA service line here at Aspirion. So I personally have over 15 years of motor vehicle experience. In fact, I was sole focused on MBA that entire time. I'm located in Denver, Colorado, and I started my journey factoring motor vehicle claims back in late 2000s. For those of you that don't know what that is, when the state of Colorado went through tort reform back in the early 2000s, it left many accident victims uninsured and without a way to obtain the medical care that they needed. So what our company did is step in and help fill that gap and began funding the treatment for these uninsured accident victims. Then we would hold the lien for those expenses that we incurred, much like what hospitals do. And then we got repaid at the time of the patient's settlements. About 5 years into the factoring of this claims, we were approached by many local hospitals who had worked with us and asked if we'd ever thought about changing our focus to become more of an outsourced vendor partner. So it wasn't long after that that we founded Continuum Health Solutions, where we grew our technology and our experience for well over a decade, and then later merged with Aspirion here just over a year ago in July of 2023. So that merger brought our best practices together to create a best-in-class MBA program. So that's just a little bit about me and my background. And with that said, Martin, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself now?
Thanks, Josh. My name is Martin Drake, and I am one of the complex claims attorneys here at Aspirion. I've been practicing since 2011, but I've had a unique professional experience in that I actually began working for the law firm from which Aspirion was born from the last 2 summers during undergrad and college, worked there all through law school, And that was the first law firm where I worked right out of law school. So I was able to see Aspirion in its infancy and its inception. I left and went and did insurance defense litigation for 9 years, did a little bit of plaintiff's work. So I've had the unique experience of seeing the claims process after a patient has been in an MVA and treated at an emergency room, kind of from all sides. And I've been back here at Aspirion for a little over 2 years now.
All right. Thank you, Martin. So again, I want to thank you for being part of today's first session of this two-part series of Cracking the Code on MBA Claims. And hopefully today's session will encourage you to sign up for that part 2 on September 11th if you haven't already. Additionally, as a quick reminder, like Lori already said, don't forget to use the Q&A feature in the webinar to post any questions that might come to mind as we're walking through the presentation. So the agenda for today, during the course of the webinar, Martin and I will walk you through what it looks like when there is a lack of focus on your MBA and TPL program. We're going to look at some ways to assess and measure the opportunity that you have to increase collections on MBA TPL accounts. And then we're going to show you 7 of our best practice recommendations to help build a focused MBA TPL program. And as time allows, at the end, we'll look for the questions that were dropped in that Q&A and answer those at the conclusion. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started. So I want to start this webinar by having a little bit of fun, telling a story with a bit of a dramatization that follows Bob, a revenue cycle director at a local hospital, 4 patients that treated at his hospital, and the different pathways that each of those patients followed after being involved in a motor vehicle accident. They're all realistic scenarios, all ones you are likely have encountered at some point in your hospitals. And in fact, it's probably one of the reasons you've joined us here today. So to introduce again, here's Bob. He's a revenue cycle director at a local hospital. And he'd be the first to admit that although they have an MBA department, it's not really their primary focus overall. And so one evening, Bob's at home trying not to think about work, which I'm sure we've all been there. He turns on the news and sees an update about an accident that involved a multi-car pileup in his local town. There were many injuries, and he knew that a few of those injuries and those patients had actually come and treated at his hospital. So he began wondering what the financial outcomes of those patients were. He knew that in his state that they had MedPay benefits available, and he also knew that there was a hospital lien statute. So he became very interested with what the financial outcome of these patients at the hospital might have been, and he decided that he would do a quick audit of those patients when he went back to work the next morning. So when Bob got to the hospital the next morning, he researched and found 4 patients that had been involved in that multi-car accident and that had treated at his hospital. Since the accident was well known around town, it had been on the news, Bob automatically assumed that all were going to be registered as MBA and go through the correct process. Instead, much to his surprise, all 4 had been registered differently. And only one of those 4 accounts actually was appropriately identified as MBA. So scratching his head a little, Bob thought, I guess I better dig deeper into these accounts and see what really happened here. So the first patient had been registered as self-pay. As Bob was reading through the hospital notes, it read, patient presented due to an MBA accident. Ask if patient was at fault for the accident to provide his coverage. At that point, Bob thought, well, I'm off to a pretty good start here. My team identified it. Continued reading. The note said, patient stated he was offended that I would assume he caused the accident. He made a scene and he began yelling, why would I give you my insurance? The guy hit me. Go find him and bill him. Refusing to give the patient access team his insurance, he was treated. Injuries totaled about $3,900, and he left the hospital upset, claiming that he would never come back. I'm sure none of you have heard that story happen in your hospital yet. The second patient was actually a minor, and again was registered as self-pay. This one referenced an MBA accident like the one before, but again, Bob did not see any coverage that had been noted in the account. Hoping it wasn't another angry patient incident, Bob read through the notes on this account. And the patient's guardian had stated that the minor's insurance was different than his due to some family things, but he didn't know what it was. He also stated that his minor child was the passenger in a friend's vehicle that was hit by someone else. Confused by the scenario and the lack of information that the guardian could provide, the patient left with a $15,000 bill and no known coverage in the hospital account. So the third patient had been registered with Medicaid. Bob scrolled through the notes on that patient, and this time there was no reference of any MBA accident at all. Instead, the patient access team simply asked the patient for their insurance, registered the patient with the Medicaid details that she had provided, and then moved on. The patient had incurred about $9,000 in billed charges at that point. So unsure what to think of these three patient accounts. Looking into the fourth one, Bob finally smiled and said, this one seems to be registered as MBA. Great. So the fourth patient had told the registration team that he was in a multi-car pileup, the big one that was on the news, said that he had MedPay coverage and that he knew it would help pay for his accident. The notes read, patient involved in MBA presents with MedPay insurance, asked patient if the other driver was ticketed to determine fault, also asked for health insurance coverage. Man, what a great job, Bob thought. They registered this one spot on. His team not only properly registered the account as MBA, but they identified three potential coverages to ensure that the nearly $30,000 bill was paid. Still frustrated a little bit at the lack of overall identification, really only 1 out of 4, Bob looked at the tenure of the registration team to see that 2 of them were new employees due to recent turnover. So Bob continued his review and looked to see what his billing and follow-up team might have found downstream. After seeing that only 1 of those 4 accounts with identified MBA coverage, he was really hopeful that their follow-up team would be able to make those adjustments and correct the patient accounts when they did their follow-up. So Bob circled back to the first patient account. This patient, if you remember, he left angry with the hospital, said he wasn't coming back, and so it really wasn't a huge surprise to Bob to see that although his team had called the patient multiple times, even sent handwritten letters to try to get his attention in the mail, there was no information provided and the patient never responded. So since Bob had never invested heavily in the MBA follow-up team, they didn't know to look for a police report or even if there were any access to property and casualty databases that maybe could have alerted them to patient details and coverage available. And after a couple of months, the patient's account fell from self-pay into collections and statements started being sent to the patient's home address. Thankfully, Bob and his team were able to speak to the second patient who had left the hospital without any identified coverage. The guardian, when talking to the follow-up team, retold the entire story that the minor child was a passenger in a friend's car hit by someone else. The hospital note read, talk to guardian, unable to determine which coverage to bill, ask for health insurance. Again, Bob knew his lack of focus on any MBA program and staff training had them confused, causing them to opt for the path of least resistance versus the potential higher paying MedPay benefit. So knowing the third patient had been registered with Medicaid, one of the hospital's lowest paying coverages, Bob was hopeful someone had caught that error because she really was in this MBA accident. Unfortunately, that was not the case. In fact, there hadn't even been follow-up on this account or anything done on it since they'd registered it in Medicaid. There was no secondary review. There was no coding alert. And the account simply passed through all the claim checks, billed to Medicaid, under the radar, untouched. And much like the third patient, there wasn't any follow-up work associated with the fourth patient's account either. However, that didn't bother Bob because as we'd already seen, his tenured patient access team member had asked all the right questions. They registered the account with 3 coverages, and they followed coordination of benefits and sent the bill out to State Farm initially, the patient's MedPay carrier, inclusive of all the accompanying documents that it needed in order to pay the bill. Man, that is how an MBA account should be processed, Bob thought. So although only 1 of the 4 accounts were registered with MBA coverage, Bob found, much to his dismay, that the hospital's financial return was still not at all what he expected to find. As Bob had seen through his review of the follow-up process, the first patient had been placed in collections and multiple statements had been sent out as a result. Remember, the patient never returned any phone calls, letters, any information was provided. Eventually, though, the patient's attorney called asking why his client's health insurance had never been billed and why they put him in collections. Customer service team apologized for the inconvenience and asked the attorney for the patient's health insurance coverage, said, hey, we'll try to bill it. Not liking that response, the patient's attorney threatened to sue the hospital if they didn't write the balance off to zero due to the mental pain and suffering that they had caused his client. Anyone heard that comment before? I'm sure we all have. Bob immediately remembered the stress that this case had put on the hospital when all this happened. He remembered how they had to get their attorney involved to keep the hospital from getting sued. And as a result, the hospital regrettably agreed to settle for a self-pay rate of just $312 on the account. Well, it can't get any worse than that, Bob muttered. But guess what? It did. After the follow-up team had settled on just billing health insurance, due to the confusion of the minor passenger in a friend's car, the hospital received a denial stating that it was actually an MVA accident that they had identified and that the patient's auto coverage should have been billed, not them, the health insurer. So expecting to get a hold of the patient's guardian as easily as they did the first time, the follow-up team went to calling again. But this time, no success. The patient's guardian never answered. And after multiple calls and months passed, so did the timely filing deadline for all the coverages that were there or could have been applicable to the patient. Discouraged, the hospital just eventually wrote that account off to timely filing. At this point, Bob didn't expect any more downstream changes on the third patient. He knew that the patient's Medicaid coverage had been billed. It had only paid at approximately 15% of billed charges, and the rest had been adjusted. So Bob knew that this was paid at a much lower rate than if MVA had been billed, but now that Medicaid had been paid, he had no choice but to accept it and move on. As he reviewed the fourth patient again, a smile finally came to his face after the frustrating previous three. The hospital received $5,000 towards the patient's bill that exhausted the benefits, and with the remaining balance, it was billed to the patient's health insurance that they had identified on file. However, in this case, the health insurance actually denied because it wasn't active at the time of the accident. But thankfully, the registration team, knowing that he was not at fault and securing all potential coverages, had identified a third party, the at-fault party, and moved the remaining balance of the account to a hospital lien to pursue with the pending TPL settlement. So that's a fun little story and scenarios that are not just problems at Bob's hospital and the team and what his teams face, right? I'm sure that every person on this webinar, including myself, Martin, Lori, we've all seen these scenarios play out over time. MVA claims are not easy. That's why they're called complex claims. And the scenarios like this are endless. You never really can guess what path they're going to take. We only walked through 4 patient accounts today, and we saw difficulty identifying opportunities. We saw patient behavior that was problematic. We saw specialized billing processes that were too hard to understand. We saw a lack of expertise to know which coverage to bill. I mean, seriously, a minor as a passenger in a friend's car hit by someone else. Whose MVA insurance do you bill for that one? And even the avoidance of legal risk by taking a reduced payment so they aren't sued by the plaintiff attorney. These are just some of the significant impacts that can affect your opportunity and the ability to collect on your MVA accounts. However, there are many more that come into play as well. And so to explain some of those additional impacts, I'm going to turn it over to Martin.
Thanks, Josh. So where you're located is going to dictate the best approach for your MVA collections and needs to be considered when you're trying to size your opportunity for increasing your cash. States have very different legal structures, such as whether you're in a no-fault state where there's mandatory first-party no-fault coverage, or a tort state where that no-fault coverage may only be optional if it's even available. There's coverage requirements, minimal limits, coordination of benefit requirements that all are going to impact how much collectible dollars are available for any given claim. Now, if you're fortunate enough to have a hospital lien statute in the state where you're located, that can help increase collections from TPL coverage. But then you've got to look at, are there costs and limitations associated with those liens that you need to consider? So, for example, are you somewhere like in Washington State where the lien must be renewed every single year? It must be canceled once it's been satisfied. And after the filing fees between renewal and cancellation, you're about $300 of sunk cost into every lien. Or are you somewhere like Illinois where you can simply mail the lien notice without having to actually file it with a clerk of court? Another thing you want to consider is, do the patient personal injury attorneys rely on the courts to decide how to allocate the settlement funds by frequently filing interpleader lawsuits where they ask the court to determine what are the reasonable and customary amount of the hospital charges? Are there specific procedures for resolving payment disputes between providers and automobile payers, like arbitration in states like New Jersey? These are geographically specific factors that need to be considered when evaluating your current program. As you can see, there are several areas to consider here. So when you're looking at those coverage requirements and limits, again, you want to look at, if you're not in one of those no-fault states like Florida, Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York, you're in a tort state like Georgia, Missouri, Colorado, Texas, is there going to be that optional available medical payments or personal injury protection coverage available? And what are the socioeconomic factors and demographics like near your facility to gauge whether your average patient is going to have that optional coverage in those states? In a lot of cases, for the average car accident victim, $5,000 in medical payments or PIP may cover a significant portion, if not all, of their emergency room bill. The next thing you're going to want to look at are the coordination of benefit requirements. Are you in a state where MBA is primary for the first party, like most of the states, or are you in a unique situation like Alabama, where some of the payers, such as Blue Cross, actually specify in the contract that it is primary before any first party auto coverage? You're going to want to know where your state law says on commercial and governmental payers, where they belong in the coordination of benefits process. We're going to talk about this more in a few weeks during part 2 of this session, but in states like Colorado, Georgia, state legislatures are passing laws requiring hospitals to bill commercial and potentially governmental payers before being able to file a hospital lien against the patient's personal injury cause of action to recover on your ER bills. Again, we're going to talk about it a lot more 2 weeks from now about hospital lien statutes, but is your facility familiar with the applicable lien statute in your state? Do you have to file the lien? Can you simply mail out the lien notice? What requirements are there to be listed in the lien, such as the patient name, date of birth, where the accident occurred, the identity, if known, of the tortfeasor, and any insurance coverages available? And are you familiar with any changes that have been passed to your state's hospital lien law? Again, here in Georgia last year, a major change was passed by the legislature when it is now required to bill the patient's health insurance prior to being able to file and perfect a hospital lien. When you're looking at underpayment issues, you want to be able to look at how often are you having underpayments? Are you catching those? Do you have not only the staff in place to work those, but the knowledge within your staff to recognize those EOBs and be able to dispute those underpayments when those are coming in? And with any MVA program, it's always crucial to have KPI metric tracking so that you can track your success. But you've got to look at and examine here exactly what metrics are you tracking. Are you simply looking at liquidation rates? Are you looking at average days to pay? Are you looking at age of counts when you've got a hospital lien and the patient is having to navigate a 2-year plus legal situation? So you want to be able to look at all of those things when you are looking at these opportunities to drive up your MVA collections. So we often get asked how to tell if there's an opportunity to significantly increase the facility's MVA collections. So we've put together some indicators to consider to help you gauge how well you're doing with your current program, and is there enough opportunity there to make it worthwhile to update your approach, whether that be internally or with a business partner. So when we're talking about those opportunities, as we'll talk about more today, account identification is absolutely critical, and the best place that that is going to occur is during the intake process for the patients when they're presenting to the emergency room after an accident. So here you're going to be really relying on your intake staff to talk to the patients as they present, and you want to look at, are your intake staff marking those accounts as MVA, or are there issues like we've mentioned where the patient is refusing to provide their health insurance due to wanting the at-fault liability billed, or do you have patients that are arriving unconscious? Do you have minor children that have been involved in accidents with their parents or caregivers and unable to get that information? Is that identification being timely made? Are you marking it as an MVA accident-related V code at the time that the patient presents, or is that something that's happening weeks after you've contacted the patient about the bill? And are you relying solely on your intake staff, or do you have any kind of ability to go back and scrub those V codes and make sure that you've captured every single MVA encounter? Now, when we're talking about payer identification, not only do you want to identify all the potential payers, so again, we're talking about that first-party med pay coverage, especially if you're in a tort state where it's not mandatory. The patient may not even realize they have it. Their insurance broker may have sold them medical payments coverage and they don't even realize it. Does your staff know the proper questions to ask the patients in those situations? And then the correct ones. Are you capturing health insurance, whether it be commercial or the governmental payers? So with billing efficiency, if you're having a lot of resubmissions, you really want to look at the reasons that you're having to do that. For each individual payer, whether it be a first-party auto payer or the commercial or governmental insurers, is electronic submission required? Is paper submission required? Do you have the correct attachments? Does that payer require you to submit the medical records along with those submissions? And are you getting submissions kicked back for failing to include all of the proper medical record documentation? And again, you want to really look at the state laws and regulations. Are you in that tort state where the medical payments or PIP coverage is only optional, or is it even available? Or are you in a no-fault state where every driver is supposed to carry that coverage? And you really want to make sure, is your facility understanding of the hospital lien law and following the lien law based on your state's regulations? And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Josh to talk about measurements.
Great. Thank you, Martin. And so once you've identified the opportunity that Martin just spoke about and what is specific to your MBA landscape, it's necessary to measure those successes or to measure the success, of your approach. So some of the measurements that we suggest that are listed here are confirmation of coverage. So what this is going to do is determine your strength of identification and that coverage discovery. It starts with patient access, but extends into your follow-up teams and the secondary analysis, as what we saw with Bob and his hospital teams. The success rate in obtaining payment. This is, in our opinion, one of the strongest measurements in analyzing your current approach. Obtaining a payment is different than just the percentage of that payment. With state regulations that will determine the necessity of coverage, the amount of coverage available, and even build charges that can easily exceed those minimal policy limits, how often you obtain a payment shows a higher success measurement than the payment rate itself. The yield of payment to total charges. So this rate can be one of the trickiest measurements. Everyone wants to compare themselves and their programs against other organizations or hospitals down the street. But because MBA coverage limits can vary drastically, even by demographics alone, the hospital down the street could have a successful MBA program, but have either a higher or lower yield rate than what your program does. This will take some research on your side to determine what a successful yield rate is for you and your hospital due to all of those factors that play into it. Underpayment identification. So oftentimes, as we all know, MedPay and PIP benefits will use repricing services for usual and customary, as well as voluntary network agreements. So you need to question and ask if those payments are correct, or are you allowing discounts that really shouldn't be applied to those claims? If there is a fee schedule, did they pay according to that fee schedule? Or do you need to see if there's an appeal or arbitration process within your state to ensure that that payment is correct and in its full amount? And then finally, missed opportunities. This will help you determine if you're maybe billing slow, not getting the bills to the payer in their preference, mail, fax, electronic, whatever that may be, resulting in them saying that they didn't get the bill. These missed opportunities will a lot of times lead to the patient's coverage being exhausted before you ever get a payment. So in the end, the real question that we're here to find out is it worth the effort? We've seen what Bob and his hospital teams went through, and we've touched on significant impacts that drive your opportunity to collect on MBA accounts, from demographics to state law, regulations. But seriously, I'm sure many people have asked themselves, why don't we, like a lot of facilities, just make the MBA claim, make them all self-pay and leave it up to the patient to figure out on their own? Is it really worth it? Is it worth the effort? And after 15 years of doing nothing but MBA accounting work, I can say, yeah, it really is absolutely worth it. Having a good MBA program will positively impact your bottom line. And it is going to help you provide reimbursements on accounts that otherwise just may not get payment at all. So not only do you get paid on services that you're providing, but the reimbursement rates are going to be higher, paying up to 100% of bill charge in a lot of cases. Whereas if you do not pursue that MBA claim, you can cause negative impacts downstream with coordination of benefits, other payers, and even the patient experience by frustration of a lack of understanding of the program. So with that said, let's move into our 7 recommendations for a focused MBA program. All right, recommendation number 1. Registration is your best opportunity to get information. I think everyone understands that when a patient is a captive audience, that is going to be your best time to get information from them. So granted, there are going to be times that patient isn't able to provide information, but when they are, making sure to ask the correct questions will keep that patient from feeling threatened or possibly putting them on the defense without even realizing it. Training the what and the how are really important here. So the what, those are your basic questions that you need to find out in order to get the bill to claim out. So for example, knowing if the patient is the driver or the passenger, knowing if there were any other occupants in the vehicle, finding out a little bit about the accident description, and who is the patient's auto insurance carrier, obviously, are just a few of the questions that are tied to that what. Because we know turnover in many patient access departments can be high, one thing that we recommend is putting into practice a simple questionnaire that can be used both within your EMR, so something like a Smart Text in Epic, or if your system can't do this, find a manual method. These questionnaires can help your patient access ensure they're asking the right questions, and they can also be used as training materials for new hires that are coming in. The how, on the other hand, helps you set the stage for the information that you want from the patient and to get their buy-in. So in other words, if I start off by asking the patient if they were at fault and caused the accident, that can be taken by the patient as accusatory, and it will put them on the defense a little bit, unsure if they're going to want to answer your questions or give you information. This posture often causes the patient to shut down a little bit, as we saw with the first patient that Bob's team interacted with in asking those kind of questions. Now, on the other hand, if I come and I ask the patient, hey, was the other driver ticketed? This changes the tone and gives you the opportunity for some further information gathering because they're not feeling like you're coming at them in an accusatory way. Additionally, patient education will help drive patient experience within your hospital and your patient access department. This can come in the form of materials given to the patient or even just by speaking knowledgeably about options for bill payment, statutes to drive the specific coordination of benefit in your state, and other motor vehicle details that show you have an overall understanding of the claims process. This is going to help that patient feel like they can trust you and be more willing to provide you the information and less resistant in allowing you to bill their claim to the proper payer. In the end, the ultimate goal here is to try to find just that one piece of the puzzle that will allow your billing and follow-up team to at least have a chance to get that bill out the door and paid. Even if the patient can provide their attorney's name or maybe even the other driver's coverage who is at fault, you can always use that information to work backwards and find a billable coverage somewhere. Recommendation number 2, timely account identification is key to success. So identifying motor vehicle accounts upon admit is extremely important, like I just mentioned, but you really need to have a secondary review process in place for accounts that have been missed. In doing so, you will have an opportunity for additional collections because of this increased identification. One of our recommendations to back up your patient access process is a V code report that can identify any potential MVA accounts that may have been missed during that registration period. This will help prevent the billing of incorrect payers that will pay at lower rates, such as patient 3, whose Medicaid had been identified and paid instead of MVA. So as you know, there are limited amounts of coverage available with those first-party benefits that are paid on a first-come, first-served basis. So having a dedicated focus on coverage discovery is really important here. Accounts that are found post-registration, especially through those V code reports, have already started to age. And so ensure you're finding the potential payers on all of those as quickly as you can. Align those payers properly through coordination of benefits and get them billed out as quickly as possible. So here are 2 actual client results from hospitals that focus specifically on recommendation 1 and recommendation 2 that we just went over. They implemented patient access training and timely account identification using the V code report that we suggested as their secondary sweep method. Both immediately saw increases in identification in the first month, with annual account identification increases as high as 147% for that critical access hospital. These accounts or outcomes are going to be consistent whether they're large hospitals or small hospitals alike. And in a subsequent slide, I'm going to show you what this increase turned into as far as collections are concerned. But before we do that, I want to pass it back over to Martin to talk through recommendations 3 and 4.
Thanks, Josh. So recommendation number 3, identifying all potential payers for an accident claim is arguably the most important piece of a good MVA program, but it can also be the most labor-intensive part. Unless you have access to a subscription, property, and casualty claims database, you're going to need to contact the patient or the guarantor, and you're going to need to know what questions to ask to those persons. Often the patients are confused about the process and they may not want to provide the information. So having resources who are well-trained on these conversations, know what questions to ask is going to be really important. As we've already mentioned, the best time to try to get this information obviously is during registration, but that's not always possible for various reasons. So you're going to need to have team members who can do this investigation after registration and treatment has occurred. Are you able to pull police reports, which is increasingly difficult based on the state in which you're located? Are you able to ask the patient if they're represented by an attorney, as they can often provide this critical additional information, but the attorneys may not be willing to share that information? So when you're looking at these various payers and identifying them, again, it's a time-consuming process, but it's ultra critical for this component of the MVA program. It requires good patient engagement and outreach. Again, knowing the specific questions to ask, like Josh has mentioned, being able to assure the patient that you're not accusing them of causing the accident or being at fault. You're simply trying to gather information about what coverage may be available for those various payers. You're going to need a good understanding of what the MVA and TPL requirements are for your state, whether you're again in a no-fault state, whether there is that mandatory first-party coverage, or if you're in a tort state where the first-party coverage may be available. And are you in a state that has a hospital lien statute, or are you in a state like Pennsylvania, Ohio, South Carolina, where there is no state hospital lien law available for your hospital? Again, the patients are going to welcome any guidance and direction that the facility can provide here. To use a personal example, like I mentioned when I introduced myself, I began working from the law firm from which Aspirion was born the last 2 summers of my undergraduate college career. Before I started working that law firm, for that law firm, I had no idea what medical payments coverage was. I didn't know what a hospital lien statute was. So you've got to assume that your average patient's probably not going to be familiar with these things and with this terminology. So again, your intake staff education and resources are going to be critical here. And unfortunately, you'll see in a lot of situations where when the patient balance is in the tens of thousands and into the 6 figures for an ER and possible inpatient visit after a automobile accident, a lot of times, unfortunately, there's going to be minimal coverage out there. There may only be a $25,000 liability or underinsured motorist policy out there, and that's going to leave a significant balance in the red on your ledger. Does your facility have some type of charity care program where you may be able to write that balance off of charity and get you back into the black and out of the red on some of those accounts? So recommendation number 4 is to coordinate all coverage, all available coverages appropriately. So again, once you've identified all of the potential payers, the next step is you've got to coordinate appropriately between them based on the requirements for your state and your facility. So that first party personal injury protection or med pay is typically going to be primary in any state, whether you're in a no-fault state like Massachusetts, Florida, or even if you're in a tort state like Georgia, where a lot of times it's contractual that first-party auto is going to be first in line. Then you're going to turn to your commercial health insurance. That's typically going to be the next step in the COB process. Here, you're really going to want to look at your legal risk, because it may be really tempting at this point if the patient has a high ER balance and you know that they've already hired one of these large advertising law firms, and maybe you know they were involved in an accident with an 18-wheeler where there may be a lot of coverage. If the patient has commercial health insurance, whether you're in a state that has a law requiring that commercial health be billed or not, there's going to be legal risk there. And again, we'll talk about that much more in a couple of weeks. But typically in that situation, you're going to want to go ahead and bill the patient's commercial health insurance, even if there are large TPL benefits available there. Now, you'll notice next that we've got the governmental payers, Medicaid and Medicare on here twice. You're thinking, is that a typo? What's going on here? It's not a typo. Again, depending on state law and regulations, the governmental payers may come in different points in the coordination of benefits process. So if you're in a state like Colorado, the Supreme Court of Colorado a few years ago interpreted their hospital lien statute to provide that federal Medicare regulations are not preempted or do not preempt the state hospital lien law, and that Colorado hospitals are required to bill Medicare before they can file a hospital lien statute. So you need to be familiar with your state's laws and regulations to know where the governmental payers come into play in the COB process. Next is going to be your third-party liability coverage, if it's available. Increasingly, more and more drivers are on the road driving without mandated liability coverage. So next in line is going to be that uninsured or underinsured first-party coverage that the patient may have. Again, your intake staff needs to have the knowledge and resources to ask those questions to the patients at registration and in any subsequent investigation attempts to ask if they have that first party UM or UIM coverage, because it may come into play and it could very well be the only source of payment for those bills. And lastly, after all of those avenues have been exhausted, that's when you're going to turn to self-pay. And with that, I am going to turn it back over to Josh.
All right, thank you, Martin. And moving on to recommendation number 5, know your payer preferences to bill quickly and correctly. So as we've already mentioned, once you've identified the correct MBA payer, it is important to submit that bill quickly. Auto insurance usually pays bills in the order of receipt, and there is a limited amount of money available to pay those first-party claims. So that said, it is important to know the payer's billing preference, as many property and casualty insurers still follow those non-traditional paths. Just because you have an electronic billing ID for an automobile insurer, it actually may not be the best way to get your claim submitted and paid. We have tens of thousands of automobile insurance adjusters programmed into our system to deliver those claims based on the individual payer preference. Rather, they prefer electronic, fax, even mail still. By being this granular in our approach, we have found that it helps avoid the need to resubmit claims because the payer is stating that they never received the bill. This also has been a more successful approach in obtaining payment as we make the payers and adjusters' jobs easier for them. An additional recommendation that we would give is to make sure to bill that coverage, even if you've been told that the patient did not carry any medical benefits coverage. This will allow you to get an actual data denial from the auto payer, and the date of that denial may help you extend the timely filing of other insurances that you were late in identifying during that discovery process. If you remember, I said I would give you the collection outcome of those 2 hospitals that we showed earlier that had put recommendations 1 and 2 in place and began increasing their account identification. These same 2 hospitals, after following those 2 recommendations and others, turned that increase in account identification into 6-figure increases in revenue for their hospital. These collections were literally just found money because previously it was a lost opportunity as the patients had never been identified as an MBA. There will always be a direct correlation from the increase in that identification and an increase in revenue for the program, as you see here. So moving on to recommendation number 6, review your payment. All insurers are trying to cut costs and pay less. This is nothing new to anyone in revenue cycle management listening today, and it is not different within your MBA program either. So that said, make sure you don't always accept the EOB or the EOR documentation as always being an accurate accounting of the payment due to your hospital. So one thing we recommend is that you push back on any discounts applied by the auto payer for usual and customary. You can actually ask the payers to provide supporting documentation for how they've identified usual and customary for your geographical location, and even what contractual authority with the hospital they have for these discounts. Most are not going to be able to provide this information to you, and as a result, the discount applied does not have to be accepted. We also recommend that you look for contractual discounts claimed by automobile insurers under health insurance contracts and voluntary networks. You've probably seen Coventry, Three Rivers, Multi-Plan, just to name a few. We see all of those often, and we advise as providers that you opt out of extending those contractual rates to any of your automobile insurers. And as it relates to no-fault states that have PIP benefits, many of those states will have fee schedules that apply to the claims, but make sure to review those just like any other fee schedule-based payer. If the payer does not pay in accordance with that fee schedule, there are legal avenues and statutory regulations that you can pursue. So know what those options are in your state for formal appeals, such as arbitration processes, to ensure that you are not being underpaid on those claims. And finally, to wrap it up here, we have recommendation number 7. We're going to want to track those results. As with any other program that's in your hospital, it's really important to know how you're doing with your MBA program. And as noted on a previous slide that I walked through, some of the measurements that we recommend for you to use to analyze that MBA opportunity are the same that you need to be tracking your results on. Those same measurements will help you establish the benchmark that you can strive for within your MBA program within your state. So again, some of these recommendations that we have are coverage identification. So remember, this determines the strength of your discovery process. This starts with patient access, but it does extend into your follow-up teams and the secondary analysis, such as B-code reports. Your days to bill. How many days is it taking you to get a bill out the door? And can you do it quicker? What is slowing you down? Missed opportunities. How often are you getting EOBs and EORs back showing that your coverage is already exhausted? MedPay and PIP are first come, first serve benefits that exhaust in time. So make sure you're billing them quickly and with the appropriate payer preferences that we talked about in order to be the first in line for that payment. Your success rate. Don't forget, this is one of your strongest measurements in analyzing your current approach and in setting those benchmarks. Obtaining a payment is different than the percentage of that payment. With state regulations that determine the necessity of coverage, like Martin's talked about, and even bill charges that can easily exceed those minimal policy limits, how often you obtain a payment shows a higher success than the payment rate itself. The yield of payment to total charge. Make sure you're taking your hospital's demographics into consideration and know what you can reasonably expect to receive from these patients' MBA benefits. Coverage limits vary drastically by state, and even within the same state, those demographics change. So focus on the payment to benefit ratio more than the payment to total charge ratios. And once you have those benchmarks in place, make sure that you review them on a regular cadence. Look into what is working and what's not working, and identify those missed opportunities. Once you've identified them, take the corrective actions you need and make your MBA program the best that it can be. And so now that we've walked through 7 of our best practice recommendations, I want to go back to Bob for a second, and I want to see how these 4 patients would have lined up and treated at his hospital had they used our recommendations. So we left Bob frustrated after his review of his hospital's financial performance. Those accounts are behind him now, and he knows things could have been different. But let's look at these same scenarios and the collectability of each if Bob had put a focused MBA program together at his hospital using the best practice recommendations we just covered. So patient number 1, Bob's patient access team really could have benefited from that specific training and patient education. Had the patient not been put on the defense and asked if it was his fault, and then had the proper explanation of how MedPay works and that it's a primary coverage, he may have better understood the process and allowed the hospital to bill his coverage. Since his MedPay limits were $5,000 and the bill charges were only $3,900, his bill would have paid at 100% of total charges instead of the small self-pay rate of just the $312. Patient 2. Bob's team needed a dedicated focus and understanding of claim identification and the discovery process. So after the second patient's health insurance denied for primary MBA coverage, the follow-up team should have known to try to either obtain a police report that could have helped them identify unknown coverage to bill primary, or potentially had access to these property and casualty databases or other coverage notification processes we talked about earlier. And even if the patient was found to not have MedPay coverage, they could have pursued one of the MedPay options from the other sources. Remember, that was the minor who was a passenger in a friend's car that was hit by someone else, or even taken the no MedPay letter that they would have received from the MBA insurance carrier and allowed them to reset the timely filing of the patient's health insurance so that Bob's team had the ability to rebill health and get the contractual payment, in this case, $5,250. With patient 3, in that scenario, Bob's team was missing a secondary review like the B-code report that would have stopped the billing to Medicaid and provided his team with the opportunity to find the appropriate MBA coverage. So the full MedPay limits of that patient were also $5,000 and would have been paid against the $9,000 charge, exhausting the patient's benefits. Now, although there's a $4,000 remaining balance, in this case, the patient's MedPay would have paid more than Medicaid had allowed, so the remainder would have been written off as a contractual adjustment. In patient 4, as we discussed, Bob's hospital team got this one right. And as a result, still has additional opportunity for collections yet to come out of that third-party settlement that has not collected yet. So with just these 4 patients, Bob's team missed a total opportunity in excess of over $12,000 just because of not having a focused MBA program.
I think, as Josh is wrapping, I really appreciate he and Martin taking the time to walk us through these recommendations and these ways to assess your program. We're just about at time right now. We do have some questions that were posed, but we will answer these questions and we'll just circulate them back out to the group. You will receive a survey about the webinar, just with 3 questions. We really would appreciate you providing your responses back to us because we really want to make these educational sessions meaningful. So it's helpful for us to get that feedback and make sure that, we're presenting information in a way that you guys can utilize and that you appreciate. And we also want to know what else you need, what other topics you're interested in learning from Aspirion. I know I covered our different services, whether it be complex claims or revenue integrity. So anything that you're interested in or that you want information about, we're happy to try to provide that. So, and if you, another reminder is to register for session 2. You can do that through the QR code there. If you haven't already registered, that session will be coming up on September 11th. So thank you all very much for joining us today. And again, thank you to Josh and Martin for providing all this information.